If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
When Miriam Giles met Alan Helmick, it was nearly love at first sight. His children worried she was after his money, so she signed a prenup that would leave her with virtually nothing. But would that prenup really be the protection Alan needed? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This is just a quick reminder that if you want more content, go check out Crimelines and Consequences, where I discuss issues and cases with my amazing co-host Eric. Or if you just want more Crimelines, I always have bonus content on Apple subscriptions and on Patreon. But let's go ahead and get into this week's case. This centers around Alan Helmick, who grew up in western Colorado, Delta to be specific. In 1963, a young woman named Sharon moved to the area, and she and Alan soon became high school sweethearts. In 1968, when they were both in their early 20s, they got married. They would go on to have 4 children, 1 boy and 3 girls, and though Alan graduated college with a degree in physics, career-wise, he would actually go into real estate. He started as a real estate broker and eventually owned his own mortgage company, as well as having a share of a title company, as well as interests in a number of subdivisions and developments. Alan was known as a hard worker, fair but tough, and always willing to help his clients find the best home they could without overextending themselves on their mortgage. Alan eventually sold the mortgage company to his daughter in 2002 as he started investing more in developments and spent less time in the day-to-day office life. He had made a good living and he was ready to slow down a little bit and enjoy the fruits of it. Alan and Sharon were married for about 35 years when, on New Year's Eve of 2003, Sharon died suddenly from a heart attack. This was a shock to the entire family, and Alan became very depressed. For his entire adult life, Sharon was front and center. He truly did not know how to face life without her. And as Sharon was only 56 when she died, he hadn't really expected that he would be widowed that soon. Alan's friends and family tried various ways to get him out of his funk, and then one suggested that he use up some credits he had at a local ballroom dance studio. Ballroom dance classes aren't just about dancing, they are very much about getting out there and socializing, which was something Alan, who had always been the life of the party when he did go out, needed to get back into. At the dance studio, Alan met Miriam Giles, the dance instructor. And in spite of their age difference, she was 48 and he was 59, they had similar stories. They both had adult children, and both were widowed within the last few years. Miriam had been married to her husband Jack for over 25 years, and they had 2 kids together, a son and a daughter. In 2002, Jack took his own life. Miriam believed Jack had never gotten over the loss of their 22-year-old daughter, who died of an accidental prescription drug overdose less than 2 years before. After the loss of both her daughter and her husband, Miriam left Jacksonville, Florida, where they lived, and she went to Gulfport, where she started teaching ballroom dance classes. When the owner of the studio had an opening at her business in Colorado, Miriam was ready for a change of pace, and she asked for the job. She moved to Colorado in early 2005 and met Alan when he started taking classes there. Within a month of meeting, the two started dating, and not long after that, Miriam moved in with Alan in his home in Delta. Unfortunately for Miriam, fraternizing with the clients is not allowed at all at the dance studio. It was actually in violation of her contract. Her relationship with Alan, in part, contributed to her losing her job there. That seemed to be fine with Miriam, though, because Alan saw potential in her dream of running her own studio. Though the owner of the old studio did send Alan messages cautioning him that Miriam wasn't quite what she seemed, the warnings didn't seem to slow the relationship down at all. When Alan went to his accountant to do his taxes in the spring of 2006, Alan mentioned he was going to open this dance studio. His accountant told him it was not going to be a moneymaker. There was already a ballroom dance studio in Grand Junction, and really, how many could the community support? So this was going to be a passion project, and Alan really never expected it to make money. Alan and Miriam then married in June of 2006 and bought a big house in Whitewater with a beautiful property surrounding it. And then Miriam and Alan opened another new business. It was another one that would be hard to make money on, a horse training business. Again, it was a passion project, more Miriam's than Alan's dream, but because Alan was providing the funding, he owned 95% of both the dance and the horse business, and Miriam owned 5% in each. Over the next 2 years, they ran both businesses in spite of them being financial losers, and Alan really focused his money-making on his residential development projects. Things had slowed down a bit, though, in early 2008 when Alan started getting sick. He had fatigue and pain in his legs, and there were days he barely felt like he could get out of bed. During this time, it became harder and harder for people to get in touch with him. Miriam would promise to pass messages on to Alan, but he would rarely return the calls. However, in late April, early May 2008, Alan started feeling better and was looking forward to an upcoming visit with his children. 2 of his kids lived out of state and would both be back in Colorado for a visit in June. And as anyone with adult kids can tell you, getting them all together at the same time is always great. But in early June, Alan's daughters kept trying to call him to finalize the plans and discuss where everyone would be staying, but he was not answering or returning calls again. With them getting into town in mid-June, it seemed like he was leaving things to the last minute. Alan's daughter, Portia, had been calling him and not getting return calls, but she knew she would see her dad face-to-face on June 9th, 2008, when he picked her daughter up for a sleepover and a horseback riding lesson. So she figured she would just talk to him then. But then Miriam called her at the last minute to postpone, saying that something was wrong with the horse that they used for these lessons. Since they didn't have their granddaughter as planned on the morning of the 10th, Alan and Miriam decided instead to run errands. They each had their own to-do list, so they were going to divide and conquer before meeting up in town for lunch. Miriam left the house around 8:15. She went to multiple stores, Walmart for groceries, Safeway to get a large bag of carrots for the horses, City Market to pick up a prescription Alan was supposed to drop off, and then she headed to a bookstore to get coloring pages for Alan's grandchildren. All of Miriam's errands were completed without issue except for that trip to City Market. When she got there to pick the medicine up, she learned that Alan had never dropped the prescription off. Miriam got to the restaurant for lunch at 11 and waited for Alan. After about 15 minutes, he hadn't shown up, so she went ahead and called him. It was the 4th call she made to his cell phone that day, and he hadn't picked up any of her calls. So each time, Miriam had left a voicemail. The first call was a little after 9 from the Walmart, and it was just a bit of a rambling message about getting groceries, and did he want her to pick up a salad and to call her about their lunch plans whenever he finished having the car serviced. She then called him again at 9:57 from the Safeway and left another voicemail about how she hadn't heard back from him, but she hoped that he had a horse bit in his truck because she wanted to return it to the store after they had lunch. Then the third call was from the city market at 10:27. Miriam got Alan's voicemail again and left a message telling him that he needed to turn on his phone and that he hadn't made it to the store to drop off the prescription yet. She told him to call if he also wasn't going to make it to their lunch date. So at 11:15, when Miriam called Alan for the fourth time, she sounded a mix of exasperated and worried. She left a voicemail saying that it really wasn't funny anymore and he was never late, but she had been sitting there for 15 minutes with no word from him. She said she was just going to head home. When Miriam arrived at the house, she pulled into the garage as usual. She grabbed her purse and the shopping bags and went in using that garage door. The garage led first into a laundry room and then continued on into the kitchen. When Miriam turned the corner into the kitchen, she saw Alan's legs as he was lying on his back on the floor. She dropped her bags and went to check on him, assuming he had had a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. But when she could see his whole body, she saw that there was a lot of blood behind his head. She grabbed the phone and called 911. Miriam was initially so upset on this call that the dispatcher could hardly understand her. She kept trying to give the address, but he couldn't figure out what street she was saying until she spelled it out. She eventually calmed down enough to tell the dispatcher that she came home, found her husband dead on the floor, and it looked like someone had robbed them. The 911 dispatcher tried to talk Miriam through CPR, and she said she was doing the chest compressions, but there was so much blood around his head and face that she didn't think she could do mouth to mouth. Due to the rural area they were in and the initial difficulty of getting the address, it took first responders a while to get out to the house, and there they found that Alan Helmick, age 62, was dead. And next to Alan was a .25 caliber shell casing. At first glance, it did look like there was a robbery. Drawers were pulled out, and Alan's wallet was near him, missing the cash he usually carried. But it soon occurred to the investigators that there were also signs that this was staged. For instance, several drawers in the kitchen were pulled out. Now think about your own kitchen drawers right now. What do you have in them? Silverware, Tupperware lids, birthday candles in a junk drawer. That's what most people have, and that's why robbers committing a home invasion during daylight hours don't waste their time in the kitchen. They go to bedrooms or medicine cabinets, depending on what they're looking for, since they have a higher chance of finding valuable items in those places. There were other drawers in the house that were open, but they weren't dumped out. Home invaders don't carefully go through drawers. They usually leave behind a mess as they dump things out or throw things aside. Aside from one jewelry box being pulled out, most things looked barely touched. And what was left behind in the house also indicated that this wasn't really a robbery. There was a laptop out in the open, which would have been easy to take and sell. And there were guns left behind in the house, and those are almost always taken during a robbery. They are easy black market money. The following day on autopsy, it was determined that Alan died of a single shot to the back of his head, with the gun being fired from at least 2 feet away. That ruled out suicide. This was definitely a homicide. The ME also noted that Alan had advanced heart disease, which may have explained some of his illness that spring. As for the time of death, the range was wide. It could have happened any time that morning, starting around 3:15 or so. And that's why the first interview with Miriam on the day of the murder was so important. It gave investigators information about what had happened during those morning hours. Miriam told the police that she and Alan got up and had coffee on the deck while they discussed their plans for the day. Their son-in-law, Josh, stayed in their downstairs area when he was on call for work, so he had been there overnight, but left by 6 a.m. Alan had about 10 things to do on his to-do list, and Miriam had a few of her own. Alan gave Miriam cash for the things she needed to buy while he went and got into the shower. He was still getting ready for the day when she left around 8:15. Miriam told the police about all of the places she stopped and the approximate times she was there, but she was actually able to do one better. She had all of the receipts still stuffed in her pocket, and she pulled them out for the investigators. They also asked Miriam about various bank and credit card accounts, likely so they could track any stolen cards. Miriam mentioned that everything was solely in Alan's name, and that was because of their prenup. They were just a few days short of their second anniversary when Alan was killed, so their prenup had never been altered. Miriam said that she wanted Alan's kids to know that she wasn't a gold digger, so they had an agreement that in the event of Alan's death or in the event of a divorce, Miriam was only entitled to assets and money acquired after they got married. Everything else, which was the vast bulk of Alan's wealth, would never be hers. If Alan died, that was all to go to his children. She told the police that she didn't even benefit from a life insurance policy because she was not the beneficiary. Most of his life insurance was set up to pay out to his business partners to cover his share of investments and loans. And since Miriam didn't really make money since her dance studio didn't even break even most months, all the money she had to spend came directly from Alan. He would usually give it to her in cash, and she said the arrangement worked because he was never stingy about it. She never felt that she wanted or needed something that Alan didn't provide. But this arrangement also meant Miriam had virtually no idea about any financial or business issues Alan may be having. The only time she was even clued in at all was one time when Alan told her to watch her spending. But that could have just been a cash flow issue. A lot of Alan's wealth was in assets and real estate, not dollars in the bank. But Miriam didn't know for sure because he never elaborated. The investigators asked Miriam about Alan's other family, i.e. his children. Miriam mentioned that he had 3 daughters and 1 son, Alan Jr., and father and son did not get along all the time. Miriam seemed unsure of where Alan Jr. even lived and said she thought he might be in Alaska, but she mentioned he was coming to town in a week or so with his sister. She did say she thought Alan Jr. would be one of the people who would benefit the most from Alan's death, but she wasn't entirely sure because she was not privy to the details of the will. Miriam also mentioned an ex-husband of one of Alan's daughters as someone else he had a contentious relationship with, but that wouldn't be someone who would directly benefit from Alan's death, unless we're talking about the motive being revenge. It seemed a bit far out there as far as a theory went, since his daughter and son-in-law had split up 2 years before this, but the truth was that Alan didn't go around making enemies or pissing people off, so it was kind of hard to come up with any theory. But towards the end of the interview, Miriam did surprise the investigators when she mentioned that this actually wasn't the first time someone tried to kill Alan. You would have thought she would lead with that, but for some reason, she didn't immediately connect the 2 incidents. It was just about 6 weeks before the murder on April 30th, 2008. Alan was selling his share of interest in a title company. Miriam went with him, but she opted to wait in the car while Alan signed the paperwork and collected the check. Alan came out, check in hand, and Miriam said her stomach was upset, so she ran inside to use the bathroom. She came out and asked Alan if he could pop open the trunk. She wanted to change into her sandals that were in there. She stood at the back of the car for a little bit before she ran back into the bathroom, telling Alan she felt sick again. So Alan sat in the car, waiting on her again, when he saw some smoke from behind the car. He first thought they were exhaust fumes since he had the engine running, but he soon realized it was something else entirely. He turned off the car and got out, realizing that his car was actually on fire. The car Alan was driving had the gas tank fill up in the back by the trunk and not the side, so it was fully possible someone snuck up and started this fire without Alan seeing them. Accounts of exactly what happened next vary, but the basic story is that Miriam was coming out of the bathroom when she realized the car was on fire, or Alan told her the car was on fire, so she either filled up a bottle or a pitcher with water and ran out to pour it on the flames. When the fire was out, they could see that there was a homemade wick sticking out of the gas tank. Fortunately for Alan, the gas tank was full. To actually have ignited that gasoline, whether to set it on fire or explode the car, there would have needed to be some gas vapor in the trunk, which there wasn't room for because the tank was full. The fire managed to damage the trunk, but mostly just the rubber lining. Alan and Miriam were both interviewed by the Delta police, and their stories were similar but not entirely the same. Like Miriam said she dropped her purse before running into the bathroom, and Alan said he didn't remember that happening. And when the police noticed the bathroom Miriam had been in smelled like lighter fluid, she said Alan had given her the wick to throw away, and she went to do so in the bathroom. But then he asked that she go get it again so that they could show it to the police, so she went back in the bathroom and got it. Alan said none of that happened.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Alan could only think of 2 people who held a grudge against him. One was a man named Don, who had been a vice president of a bank where there was some shady business going on. Alan had some involvement in the case against him, with some sources saying he testified against Don in court, though I couldn't find a primary source for that. The other person was a woman named Barbara, the owner of the dance studio where Alan met Miriam. She was upset that they started a competing business and took clients away. Miriam had also mentioned Barbara when she was asked about anyone who might want to hurt Alan, but it had been 2 years since everything happened between them, and Barbara wasn't even in Colorado. She lived in Mississippi. The police in Delta didn't think Barbara or Don were behind this. They thought it was Miriam. After all, she was at the trunk supposedly changing her shoes just moments before Alan noticed the fire. Both she and Alan had put her right where the wick was. To get to the truth of the matter, the investigators bluffed. They told both Miriam and Alan separately that there were security cameras on a business that would show who went near the car. There were not, in fact, any such security cameras that saw anything. This was just asked to apply some pressure. They asked Miriam what they would see when they checked this imaginary camera, and she said hopefully they would see the person who set the fire. When they asked Alan, they asked him what he would say if it was Miriam they saw on camera. Alan said he didn't think she could have done it. He admitted that Miriam had a shaky financial past, including accusations of theft after her late husband left behind huge debts for her to pay. But he insisted she wasn't malicious. She was a good person. And besides, what would she gain? Alan pointed out the prenup and said straight out that he was worth more to Miriam alive than dead because that's the only way she had access to his money. And he gave her pretty much everything she asked for. With or without security footage, the investigators still believed it was Miriam. Their theory was that she went into the bathroom where she rigged up her wick and doused it in lighter fluid. She went to the trunk to get her sandals, but instead stuck the wick into the tank and lit it on fire. She faked another round of stomach issues, so she had an excuse to run to the bathroom and wait until Alan blew up. It didn't seem like a coincidence that this happened as soon as Alan sold his share of the business for more than $100,000. Anything he earned during the marriage would be Miriam's in the event of his death, and should that include this check? That seemed like a motive right there. The issue was that they couldn't prove Miriam did it. The case remained open, and they warned Alan to be careful as clearly someone was trying to kill him, but it's pretty obvious he didn't think Miriam had anything to do with it. Alan believed the fire may have just been a prank because he saw some teens hanging in the area while he was in the car. He didn't see them come up to the car, but like I said, the tank was in the back, so they could have snuck up without him seeing them. But the police, who were now investigating a successful attempt on Alan's life, were shocked to hear that there had been an unsuccessful attempt so soon before it. So they quickly reached out to the Delta police and got filled in on all of this. They knew they needed to dig into Miriam some more, and no one pushed for that more than Alan's children. They had almost immediately suspected her. The investigators first spoke with Alan's daughter, Portia, who ran the family mortgage company. She told them that before her father remarried, she talked to him regularly, at least twice a week. After marrying Miriam, it was harder to get him to pick up the phone. Her sister Wendy backed this up. She actually lived with her dad and Miriam for several months after her divorce. But when she moved out, she couldn't get a hold of Alan on the phone either, except for once in a blue moon. She always left messages, and when she finally had a chance to talk to Alan, she asked him why he hadn't returned any of her calls. He said he never got any messages. It did make some sense in early 2008 when Alan was sick for several months that maybe he didn't call people back in a timely manner. Maybe he just didn't have the energy for phone calls, but he always seemed confused on why he wasn't getting the voicemails that everyone claimed they left for him. The times anyone would answer Alan's cell phone, it was often Miriam who would then promise to pass on any message, and she claimed she did, but Alan would not return calls. After the car fire, Portia did get a call from the Delta police who said they had been trying to reach Alan and also couldn't get him on the phone. Portia ended up calling Miriam, who said Alan was too busy to come to the phone at the moment. It was only when Portia said the police had called her that Miriam put Alan on the phone. Portia used this opportunity to ask Alan why he hadn't been answering, and she heard Alan ask Miriam where his cell phone was and if she had turned it off. This confirmed to Portia what she had suspected at this point. Miriam had control over Alan's cell phone. She wasn't holding it for him, but rather keeping it from him. Portia's 9-year-old daughter was supposed to be at the house in Whitewater on the day of the murder, and Portia told the police about the arrangement. The lessons were supposed to be on Tuesdays that summer, so Alan and Miriam would pick her up the night before. She'd have a grandparent sleepover on Monday, lesson on Tuesday, and then they would drop her off at home after. This went well on June 3rd, which was the first day of the lesson, but then Miriam called Portia the night before the second lesson to reschedule. Portia was a little disappointed because she really needed to talk to Alan, but they went ahead and rescheduled for Friday. The reason Portia was eager to talk to Alan was because on June 4th, she had gotten a call from his bank. This is a small area, so Alan's bank calling him wasn't impersonal, coming from a manager Alan had never met. He was actually friends with the bank manager, which made the situation all the more awkward. He called Portia on June 4th, saying that he had been trying to reach Alan for 2 months. He called him and even sent letters, but no one could actually get a hold of Alan. Now, everyone at the bank knew that Alan had been sick, so they first wanted to make sure he was okay. And then the manager wanted to see if Portia could get Alan to call the bank as soon as possible. There was something there that needed to be dealt with immediately. Portia was alarmed by this since Alan was always on top of business and financial matters. And then she became more alarmed when, not long after the call from the bank, Alan's insurance company called her to notify her that they were closing his policy due to lack of payment. And again, they hadn't been able to reach him to notify him of this directly. Portia then spent the next 5 days calling Alan no less than 3 times a day, leaving messages and waiting to hear back from him. Instead of hearing from Alan, she did hear from Miriam, who told her that Alan asked Miriam to call the bank and tell them that Alan was getting medical treatment in Denver and needed Miriam to be able to cash a check for him. Miriam was not a signatory on any of Alan's accounts. It seemed like this was her explanation as for why the bank must have been trying to reach Alan. But Portia did not think it rang true. Alan was not someone who told lies, and lying about a medical treatment in Denver when anyone could have seen him around town was bizarre. Portia did not believe Miriam, so she did not stop calling Alan's phone, hoping he'd eventually pick up and they could figure out what was going on. Alan's other children were having similar issues trying to get a hold of him, and they just kept leaving messages. On June 9th, Portia called to see if Miriam and Alan were coming to pick up their granddaughter for her second writing lesson. She assumed they were, but she hadn't heard from either of them to confirm. When Miriam eventually called her back to postpone the lesson, Portia asked to speak to Alan. Miriam said he wasn't there, but rather he was at an appointment he had at 2:00, and he had told Miriam that he planned to stop at Portia's house after the appointment. Alan never showed up, so Portia called Miriam again and asked that Alan call her when he got home. The call didn't come, so Portia called her husband Josh, who was staying at the house, since he was on call for work. He said that Alan and Miriam were both home out at the barn. Later that night, Miriam called Portia again and said that Alan went to the Elks Lodge and came home drunk, which was why he couldn't call her that night. Portia never knew her father to go out and get drunk, let alone drive home in that condition, so she didn't know what to make of this. The next day, June 10th, Portia started her day by making her usual calls to her father, and then she called Miriam, who answered. Miriam said she was at Walmart and would give Alan the message when they met for lunch. Portia knew the likelihood of hearing from her father was low, but she figured she was going to see him in a few days anyway, face to face, and she could tell him about the bank call and the insurance cancellation and ask him what was happening. But she would never get to learn that because hours later, Portia would find out that her father had been murdered. Portia told the police that she did not believe Miriam's excuse as to why they canceled the writing lesson, and that was because of something Alan's best friend Bob had said. Bob went out to Portia's house after he learned about Alan's death to check on her. He said that he had just spoken to Alan the day before about going golfing. When Bob first invited Alan, he said he couldn't go because his granddaughter would be over, and Alan was the type who cleared his schedule when the grandkids were there and put all of his focus on them, so he didn't want to miss watching her writing lesson. He told Bob that if they ended up moving the lesson to a different day, he could then make the golf outing. But then Alan called later that evening and said they were not able to move the lesson, so he wouldn't be meeting Bob for golf. The issue was that Miriam had already called Portia and told her the lesson had been moved, and now here's Alan saying that they couldn't move the lesson. So why the 2 stories? But why have 2 conflicting stories when you could have 3? The investigators went to the horse riding instructor and asked her about the lesson. She told them that she absolutely did not cancel it, and she was unaware of any issues with the horse. She had been called around 8:45 the morning of the murder. Miriam told her that they hadn't made it out to pick up their granddaughter the night before and they didn't have time that morning, so they had to cancel. Miriam said she would still pay for the lesson since they canceled at the last minute and offered to drop the check off, but the instructor told her she could just mail it. This call was verified through Miriam's cell phone records. So Miriam told Portia the lesson was postponed by the instructor. She apparently told Alan it was still on, and then she told the instructor that it was canceled at the last minute. When the police talked to Alan's other daughter, Wendy, about things, she said more than just the writing lesson didn't make sense. When she lived with Miriam and Alan, she never knew Miriam to go out running errands alone. She hardly left the house without Alan, and leaving the house before 10 a.m. was also something she knew Miriam never did, as she was not a morning person. The family did express concern to the police that Alan's illness may have been the result of a poisoning, but there was nothing in his tox screen or autopsy that indicated that. The ME said that his heart disease could have caused the exact symptoms he was experiencing, and it isn't uncommon for those symptoms to come and go. The investigators still wanted to dig more into Miriam, particularly when they learned what Alan mentioned to the Delta police about first having financial issues in her past, and also that she already had a different husband die. In pulling Miriam's record from Florida, they learned that Miriam had been arrested for cashing counterfeit checks in early 2004. But beyond that, her biggest alleged theft that they learned about was from her brother. He hadn't spoken to her in years, in large part due to what she did to her father and stepmother. After Miriam's first husband, Jack, died, Miriam ended up selling her house and moving in with her father, Frank, and his wife, Frankie. She said that she couldn't stand to live in the house where Jack had died all on her own. But the truth was, she had a lot of debts and judgments against her for defaulted loans and huge credit card balances. It looks like she sold her home to cover those debts. Frank had just had heart surgery, and Frankie was in treatment for cancer when Miriam moved in, so having someone around to help out for a couple of months seemed great. Miriam took on managing bill payments and all of that. After 6 or 8 weeks living there, Miriam managed to buy a new house and all new furniture. Frankie made a comment about how Miriam could afford all of that, and she said thanks to life insurance and Jack's 401k, she was pretty much set. She worked part-time to pay for incidentals and day-to-day expenses, but other than that, she didn't need to worry about money. Unfortunately, that wasn't to last. Miriam eventually confided in Frankie that it turned out Jack hadn't paid taxes, and due to other debts, she didn't have the amount of money she thought she had. She ended up selling this house a short time later and moved into a rented room. But being a dutiful daughter, Miriam still went out to the house around noon every single day to visit and check in with her dad and stepmom, even after she moved out. Then one day, Frank got a phone call from his bank. His account was overdrawn by $10,000, which Frank just could not understand. He went to the bank to figure out what was going on, and they saw that there had been a large withdrawal. They pulled the security footage and showed it to Frank, asking if that was his wife, and he said, no, it wasn't. It was his daughter, Miriam. He had also found out that there were checks written to a dancewear company that he didn't authorize, and it's believed Miriam wrote and cashed them herself when she had access to his checkbook during his surgery recovery. It also made her daily visits, which included bringing in the mail, make a lot of sense. She was intercepting his bank statements. After this trip to the bank, Frank went home and called Miriam. He said she needed to come over after work and talk it out. She agreed, but then never showed up. That night, Frank and Frankie's back porch, which shared a wall with their bedroom, went up in flames. It was ruled an arson, but thankfully the fire never really took off. The next day, Frank went to Miriam's rented room to see what was going on, and there he found that she had cleared out. Asking about her at work, he learned that after he called her the day before, she got up from her desk, walked out, and never came back. Miriam eventually sent an email to her father saying she left to relocate to Maryland and that she would be able to explain everything someday. What she had actually done was move to Mobile, Alabama, where her mother lived, stole a few $1,000s from her, allegedly, and then went on to Gulfport, Mississippi. Her father and stepmother did file a complaint against her, though she was not arrested, and it looks like, all told, Miriam stole somewhere between $90,000 and $120,000 from both of her parents, but the bulk of that came from her father. In Gulfport, Miriam became active in the local ballroom dance community, and that's how she met Barbara, who owned the studio. Miriam was very good at both dancing and at engaging with others, so Barbara offered her a job as an instructor. Things went well at first, but when another instructor quit suddenly, money went missing. Barbara did have it in the back of her mind that it could have been Miriam, but when paired with the other instructor leaving, she figured it was probably him. Then when Miriam learned that the manager of the Colorado-based dance studio was leaving, she asked Barbara if she could have the job, and Barbara said yes. The two flew to Colorado together to get Miriam situated, and then Barbara returned to Mississippi alone. Soon enough, Barbara was seeing charges come through on the company card she left for Miriam to use. However, they were clearly not all business-related. She called Miriam, who dodged her calls for a little while, but when she did finally talk to her, Barbara told Miriam to send the card back. She was going to have to keep a closer eye on Miriam's spending.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
One day, Barbara was doing the books and realized that her bank account wasn't balanced. She called the bank and asked for copies of all the checks written from the account. And when she got them, she saw that there were several that were clearly forged. She thought back to a checkbook that went missing back before Miriam moved to Colorado. Barbara thought it was in her car, but she couldn't find it and assumed she just misplaced it. But the last person in her car before she couldn't find the checkbook was Miriam, who she had given a ride to. And now these forged checks confirmed to Barbara that Miriam had taken the checkbook. Barbara went ahead and filed a police complaint. What she didn't do was immediately fire Miriam because she wanted to see her prosecuted for stealing money. And Mississippi wasn't exactly going to go to Colorado to pick her up for a petty crime like this. So instead, after the arrest warrant in Mississippi was issued, Barbara told Miriam that she had to come back to Gulfport for some additional training in the spring of 2005. When Miriam got into town for what she thought were classes, she was arrested. Miriam was released on bail and returned to Colorado, being fired for both stealing and for breaking her contract by getting into a relationship with a student. So Barbara decided to send all of the info she had on Miriam over to Alan to show him that she had embezzled money from the company. She warned Alan to be careful, and it does make you wonder if that's why Alan, though he did decide to still marry Miriam, opted not to give her any access to bank accounts. He had told the police back at the time of the car fire that Miriam had financial issues, but she wasn't malicious, and maybe that's what he believed. She wasn't necessarily out to get his money, but he didn't really trust her with it either. The charges against Miriam in relation to the dance school ended up being dropped after Hurricane Katrina devastated the coastline in August of 2005. A lot of small cases like this ended up being dismissed because they just didn't have the ability to handle them in a timely manner. So while Miriam was technically considered not guilty, that was not from a judge or jury verdict. It was a hurricane making her crime a low priority. After Miriam left Gulfport for good, Barbara started cleaning out the cottage behind the dance studio where Miriam had lived. Barbara found a bunch of altered bank statements with Miriam's dad's name on them, which was essentially proof Miriam had been stealing from her father. Barbara didn't know what to do with it until Miriam filed a lawsuit against her, claiming she was illegally withholding Miriam's belongings that were left in the cottage. So Barbara countersued for the money Miriam had stolen and then called Miriam's dad to let him know what she had found in the cottage. He then called Miriam, telling her that he was going to testify against her in Barbara's case. At that point, Miriam dropped her lawsuit, but Barbara did not drop her countersuit, and the two ended up settling out of court. So right up to her marriage to Alan, Miriam was having trouble with money, as in she was taking money that wasn't hers. So what were the odds she just stopped doing it when she married Alan? What were the odds she wasn't also taking money from him? It seemed likely because the bank was trying to get in touch with him, so that was a good place for the investigators to start. Now, it turned out that the entire spring while Alan was ill, his finances took a major downturn, particularly with bills going unpaid. The police found a letter in the mailbox delivered the day of the murder, notifying Alan that he had defaulted on 2 loans and that they had been trying to contact him about them. The bank had taken the money out of his account to pay what they could. They took nearly $140,000. However, that still left a balance of $37,000 between the 2 loans that Alan needed to pay immediately. Because these loans were tied to properties, he was at risk of foreclosure. So the question was, did Alan know this was his financial situation and was purposely dodging the bank? Or was Miriam keeping the information from him, much like she did to her father? Alan's kids definitely thought this was Miriam's doing, as Alan always dealt with business matters in a forthright manner, even when it wouldn't be to his favor. He wouldn't have hidden from the issue. He would have gone down to the bank and figured it out. The bank told the police that there was another reason they were trying to reach Alan. They believed that some checks coming through were not signed by him, but rather by Miriam. The initial assumption was that Alan was letting Miriam sign the checks since he was sick and unable to do so, but they needed him to either add her as a signatory on the account or stop letting her sign checks, one or the other. When they didn't hear back from Alan on either matter, they made a note in the account so that the next time Miriam tried to cash a check, it wouldn't go through. Miriam, as expected, tried to cash a check that she herself had signed and was confronted about it. She said she would have Alan call and confirm that he gave her permission to do this, but no surprise, Alan never called. In pulling the canceled checks, it was determined that at least 11 checks had been flagged as fraudulent. Some were written out to Miriam directly, but others were to her dance studio, and it was around $16,000 just from these checks that she had pocketed. This investigation kept leading back to Miriam as having a motive, in spite of what she said about not inheriting much from Alan. Alan was about to find out what was going on now that the bank had called his daughter. It wasn't just about what Miriam was going to gain with Alan's death. It was also about what she was trying to avoid, which would be to be exposed as a thief. But Miriam was telling people, including the police, that not only was she not the murderer, the real killer appeared to be stalking and harassing her. After Alan's death, Miriam moved back into the house. She really had nowhere else to go. But within a week, she noticed some odd things. She would come home and find drawers open, or a door that she left locked would be unlocked. Sometimes a light was on that she swore she had turned off. She would sometimes think she heard someone in the house. Other times she saw a truck drive slowly by, only to speed off when they saw her. Miriam did not think the police were taking these reported incidents seriously. And then about 2 weeks after Alan died, Miriam called her friend Penny. She had been out for the morning and she got home in the afternoon only to find that the lights in the bathroom were on and the medicine cabinet was wide open. She was scared, so she left and called Penny, seeing if Penny would go home with her, since whoever was doing this never seemed to do it when other people were around. Penny was still at work. It was only 1:45 in the afternoon when Miriam called, so she told Miriam to go over to her house and relax, and she'd come get her after work. Penny got off work at 3 and picked Miriam up. They ran some errands together before going back to Penny's house so Miriam could get her car, and then they drove over to Miriam's. Miriam approached the garage as usual when she noticed that the police tape on the front door had been pulled down. Oddly, she had left the police tape up even after the police cleared the house and turned it back over to her. She said it was because she didn't really use the front door and she was worried that the police tape was going to pull up the stucco, so she just left it there. She and Penny went together to the front door to see what was going on, and they saw a yellow greeting card envelope under the welcome mat. It was addressed to the grieving widow with grieving misspelled, and inside was a card that showed a woman sitting in a chair and the quote, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results," printed on it. Miriam opened the card, and on the inside, someone had written in block printing, "Alan was first, you're next, run, run, run." Alan was spelled incorrectly, A-L-L-E-N, and they used the wrong your when they wrote you're next, but this was terrifying even with the misspellings, and so they ran to Penny's car. Penny had grabbed the card and put it in the back seat, intending to call the police, but Miriam said not to call, and instead she called her attorney. Now, her attorney did tell her to go to the police with it, which she did the next day. The card was looked at, but block letters are hard to match with handwriting. They noticed that the UPC code on the card was cut out, so it did look like someone was hoping the police would not be able to track it. But a UPC code in a small town isn't exactly necessary. They learned the card was only sold at city market stores, and they figured out how many cards could have been sold in the last few weeks that would ring up the same as that one based on product and price. They found only 3. They pulled the security footage to see who bought the cards, and one of the people who bought a card was Miriam Helmick. She bought it 4 days before it showed up on her doorstep. By the time this had been discovered, however, Miriam had moved out of town. She was struggling in the weeks after Alan's death because the accounts had been frozen and she had no money, or rather, no access to money. She sold a few things until the court stopped her, and then she got into a car and drove off. She initially went to Georgia and then to Florida to move in with her son, Chris. When the police reached out to her son, he did confirm that she was there and not intending to return to Colorado. They asked about the vehicle Miriam was driving, and Chris confirmed that she was driving an Oldsmobile convertible. This was significant because that car was part of the estate that she was not entitled to. It was Alan's from before the marriage. In fact, Sharon, Alan's first wife, used to drive it. His family then added it to the list of big-ticket items that were missing from the house, including a $4,000 ring, a snowmobile, and some equipment for the horses. Most of those things appear to have been sold. Miriam offered at one point to return the car to Colorado, but she made no other inquiries into the estate, of which she was entitled to some of it, like the equity in the house they bought after their marriage. Miriam seemed to be trying to fly under the radar at this point. So the police kept an eye on Miriam's location while they continued to investigate and build their case. One issue was that the murder weapon was never found, and it was hard to prove that Miriam ever had a .25 caliber gun or had access to one. It did appear, though, that Alan's first wife, Sharon, had inherited a handgun from her stepfather after his death, and it was possible that this was a .25, but no one knew for sure. It turned out that the police found an interesting way to find out if it was a .25. Sharon's stepfather had confronted his ex in the mid-1980s, and he had his handgun with him. There was a tussle over it with someone who tried to intervene, and the gun went off, striking the ground. So the investigators, in 2008, pulled out a metal detector, and they went to the yard to see if they could find the 20-year-old bullet in the ground. And they did. It was, in fact, from a .25. The striations that could be seen were consistent with the bullet from Alan's murder. However, the damage to the respective bullets was just too great to make any sort of match. While this did help fill in a gap for the police, it was way too circumstantial for court. I mean, Sharon's stepfather had a gun that was a .25, and she inherited a gun from him, and then Alan maybe kept the gun after her death. There was some paperwork from his estate indicating that Sharon intended to sell the gun, so they really couldn't even prove that she still had it, let alone that Alan still had it, let alone that Miriam had access to it. Now, this case was already going to be a circumstantial one, and this was too much of a stretch. I only really wanted to mention it because I thought it was a creative way the police tried to figure out if this was the murder weapon. Among the other circumstantial evidence collected during the investigation were computer searches from Miriam's computer. I want to be clear that Alan would have had access to this computer since they lived in the same home, but this was the computer that Miriam usually used. On the computer were various searches made in May and June about overdoses. Some were vague, like painkiller overdose, but some were specific, like lisinopril overdose, Ambien overdose, Viagra overdose, all medications Alan took. The investigators had also started poking more holes in Miriam's story. They already knew she had multiple stories about canceling the writing lesson. But then they learned that Miriam had also lied to Portia when she said Alan was drunk the night before the murder and couldn't come to the phone. They spoke with the bartender at the Elks Lodge, and she said she hadn't seen Alan that night. In fact, she hadn't seen him in months, so she definitely would have remembered it if he came in on a random Monday night and got drunk. The investigators also learned that Miriam had lied about the life insurance situation when she said she wouldn't collect from it. In late 2007, about 7 months before the murder, Alan and Miriam looked into getting life insurance policies. This time, it would have Miriam as a beneficiary. Miriam had wanted to get it for something like $2 million, but with Alan's existing policies, his age, and some other factors, the cap for him was $250,000, which was still more than Alan wanted to take out. Miriam ended up on the phone with the insurance agent to ask about getting the higher policy. She was curious if Alan had to know about it. They said of course he needed to know about it, particularly since a high-dollar policy like that, at his age, would require a full physical and health evaluation. Alan ended up taking out a $25,000 policy with Miriam as the beneficiary, which is in contrast to Miriam's claim that she got next to nothing in the event of Alan's death. And we know Miriam did know about this policy because she tried to collect it a week after the murder. However, the policy had been canceled because in the short time it had been active, the premiums were repeatedly unpaid. In all the dodging of the bank and family and everything else, Miriam also apparently missed paying on the life insurance. Another thing that came up in the investigation went back to the arson of the car. Someone mentioned that it sounded like the scene in the movie No Country for Old Men, where someone put a rag in a gas tank and set it on fire. They wondered if that's where the inspiration came, so they checked the television records for Miriam and Alan leading up to the fire. 4 days before the fire, someone at the house had rented that movie. Now, I personally think renting a movie is far from a slam dunk when we're talking about evidence, but much like the .25 caliber bullet they dug up, it told the investigators that they were still on the right track, even if this was not anything that would show up in court. Unfortunately, what they didn't have was physical evidence. There was no GSR found on Miriam's hands or clothing that morning, but there was some on her steering wheel. Much like everything else, it raised suspicion and alone wouldn't be enough, but the investigators hoped the totality of the evidence would be. And as they were still trying to figure out the pieces of the case in Colorado, Miriam had started moving on in Florida. She signed up for a matchmaking website geared towards wealthy people. One of the things the site required was an identification verification, and Miriam did not use her own ID. She used Alan Helmick's. When she left Colorado, Miriam had taken Alan's late wife's ID with her. Through this website, Miriam met Chuck, who was a champion ballroom dancer and had owned ballroom dance studios himself. He had recently moved to Orlando, Florida, and signed up for the website hoping to meet someone. And he met Miriam, though he thought she was named Sharon. The two emailed and talked on the phone. Miriam said that her husband had died earlier that year, and Chuck expressed some surprise that she was out dating so soon. Miriam explained that they were actually on the verge of divorce when her husband was diagnosed with a brain disease. She didn't want to leave him while he was sick, so she stayed and took care of him for a few years until his death. So she was able to move on so quickly because the marriage itself had actually been over for a while. Chuck liked Miriam and invited her to Orlando, and she made the trip from Jacksonville one weekend for a date and ended up staying over. As their weekend together was wrapping up, Chuck thought maybe they'd continue their relationship and see where it went. Miriam, however, made a comment about how great it would be if she lived in Orlando. And then it turned to a comment of how maybe she should just go ahead and move to Orlando. And by the end, it almost sounded like she was suggesting moving in with Chuck. It was all far too much, far too quickly. She went home to Jacksonville, and Chuck tried to just fade away from her life until the police called him and told him that the woman he had very briefly dated was not Sharon, but rather Miriam, and she was suspected of killing her husband. Chuck was curious, and he asked how she killed her husband, and he was surprised to hear them ask him which one. Though the Jacksonville police stood by their ruling that Jack Giles' death was a suicide, the Colorado police doubted it. The most glaring issue was the gun placement. Jack was left-handed, but the gun was in his right hand. And he was also found with his thumb on the trigger, which is an uncommon way to fire a gun. Miriam was in the room with Jack when he was shot, whether by himself or someone else, and according to her, she was lying in bed next to him, and he put up a pillow barrier between them when he fired. And the theory was that he put the pillow up to protect Miriam from any blood spatter. But if he was worried about protecting her, why did he shoot himself in the room with her at all? Not just in the room, but in the bed. Why not go somewhere else? They also learned that Jack had died in the midst of all sorts of legal and financial issues, the same ones that caused Miriam to sell the house to pay it all off. The Colorado authorities certainly didn't think it was a coincidence that Miriam had two husbands die of gunshot wounds to the head while dealing with financial problems largely of her making. But they had no jurisdiction over Jack's case, and they were forced to drop the issue. The case they did have jurisdiction over was Alan Helmick's, and on December 8th, they had what they needed to make an arrest. They pulled Miriam over in Jacksonville and arrested her for Alan's murder and the attempted murder through arson, as well as several forgery charges for the checks she had cashed. When she was arrested, Miriam was found with credit cards and pay stubs in Alan Helmick's name, having fully assumed her identity. The trial started in November of 2009. The state wanted to be able to bring up Jack's death as it showed a pattern, but because the death was ruled a suicide and Miriam was never charged or convicted in the case, it was excluded. The state's theory was that Alan had figured out something was amiss. The couple's housekeeper was over the day before the murder and had told the police that things were tense that day, unusually so, and she felt like the two may have been arguing. And whether Alan knew there were issues or not doesn't really matter because Miriam knew he would find out as soon as he talked to his daughter, Portia. She managed to push that off by a few days, but eventually Alan would hear that the bank was calling. Miriam canceled the horseback riding lesson and waited for their son-in-law to leave for work. She then went up behind Alan and shot him before cleaning herself up and leaving for her errands. She made several stops, which gave her time-stamped receipts, and she made a bunch of phone calls from all of these various stops, which also gave her time-stamped phone records. Her alibi was being documented all morning long, while Alan was actually already dead. Now, we've already gone over the evidence the state had, so let's go ahead and get into the defense. They accused the police of suspecting Miriam on day one and never veering from that course, only looking for evidence that implicated her. They did admit that the greeting card was planted by Miriam, but it was because no one took her other complaints about the weird things at the house seriously. She did it to get the police attention because she felt she was truly in danger. Miriam opted to testify in her own defense, and she denied the forgery claims, saying that she never signed a check without Alan's permission. And more than just his permission, it was always at his request that she signed those checks. She denied she kept his phone from him. She did hold on to it and managed it while he wasn't feeling well, but she passed on every message, and Alan was free to call people back or not. Now, if he didn't do it, that wasn't her fault. And the night before the murder, when she told Portia that Alan was too drunk to come to the phone, she admitted that was a lie, but she said she lied at Alan's request. She just did what he told her to do. As far as the calls from the bank went, she said she was just as frustrated as anyone else that Alan wasn't dealing with it. He told her not to worry about it, but it was putting her in a bad position with the bank when he wouldn't just handle it. She denied trying to get life insurance behind Alan's back, saying that she only asked about getting the insurance without Alan there because she worried they'd deny the policy completely since he smoked and had high blood pressure. The insurance agent had testified to this conversation differently, saying that Miriam was very clearly asking about getting a policy without Alan's permission. Now, as far as canceling the granddaughter's writing lesson, which the state said was a sign that Miriam had premeditated the murder, Miriam said canceling the lesson was not her idea. Alan was the one who wanted to cancel it because he wasn't in a good mood, and he didn't think he had the energy or patience to be fully attentive. Miriam testified that she had built her own relationship with Alan's grandchildren, so she didn't want to cancel the plans. But as always, she did what Alan told her to do. When asked about the computer searches, Miriam denied making them and insinuated that Alan may have been the one. Though the computer was on a desk surrounded by her things and Alan had his own computer, she insisted that she and Alan shared that computer. Some of the searches were made in the middle of the night, and Miriam said she was always asleep at 2 or 3 in the morning. Alan, however, had trouble sleeping, which is why he was on Ambien, and he would have been the only one awake to make those searches at those times. Pretty much anything and everything suspicious about Miriam's story as it pertained to the murders was somehow, through her testimony, placed back at Alan's feet. She even blamed him for the forged check, saying he told her to do it. The only charge left for her to answer to was the attempted murder charge for setting fire to the vehicle. Miriam's story of what happened that day changed a bit on the stand. Instead of going to the back of the car to get her sandals and then racing off to the bathroom, she claimed she never made it to the trunk at all and had gone straight to the bathroom. She was no longer putting herself in proximity to that homemade wick. On cross-examination, Miriam was basically hit with how probable it was that all of these circumstances lined up to cast suspicion on her, and how all of her explanations involved the one person not there to answer for it, and that was Alan. The jury took the case and deliberated for 5 hours. They later said they spent the bulk of that time debating the forgery counts, because on the murder and attempted murder charges, they quickly determined she was guilty. On the forgery charges, they convicted her on all but one of them. Miriam was then sentenced to life without parole for the murder of Alan Helmick, and the judge then tacked on an additional 108 years for the other charges. The judge said it didn't matter if the 108 years were mostly symbolic. They were necessary to make sure the sentence fit all of the crimes Miriam was convicted of. Miriam has appealed her case without success and remains incarcerated in Denver at the age of 66. Thank you for listening. You can find Crimelines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crimelines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.
You've worked hard for what you have. Your money, your assets, your 401k, and home. Isn't it all worth protecting? Nearly 1 in 4 consumers have been a victim of identity theft. LifeLock Ultimate Plus helps protect your finances with up to $3 million in reimbursement. LifeLock alerts you to identity threats you might miss. And if your identity is stolen, your dedicated U.S.-based restoration specialist will work to fix it. Let LifeLock help protect what you've worked so hard for. Save 25% off your first year on LifeLock Ultimate Plus at LifeLock.com/aware. Terms apply.